Reading the Times for January 11th, 2020. Reading the Times for January 11th, 2020. Iran says it unintentionally shot down Ukrainian airliner. On social media, Iranians began expressing anger toward the military soon after the announcement, many of them using the term harshest revenge, which officials had repeatedly promised in the wake of the American drone strike that killed Major General Qasem Soleimani, a powerful Revolutionary Guards commander, last week. The Iranian military's statement said the plane took the flying posture and altitude of an enemy target as it came close to an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps base. As late as Friday night, officials were weighing whether to blame faulty jet equipment in acknowledging that Iranian missiles brought down the jet, according to 4 Iranians familiar with the deliberations. U.S. unsuccessfully tried killing a second Iranian military official. The American military unsuccessfully tried to kill a senior Iranian military official in Yemen on the same day a drone strike killed Major General Qasem Soleimani, Iran's most powerful commander, according to American officials. On Friday, Mr. Trump expanded his description of the threat from Iran that he said prompted the strike on General Soleimani, saying Iran had planned to attack multiple embassies across the Middle East, including the American embassy in Baghdad. I can reveal that I believe it probably would have been 4 embassies, Mr. Trump told Laura Ingraham of Fox News. We don't know exactly which day it would have been executed, but it was very clear Qasem Soleimani himself was plotting a broad, large-scale attack against American interests, and those attacks were imminent. Asked how he defined an imminent threat, Mr. Pompeo replied, "This was going to happen, and American lives were at risk." A senior administration official said Friday that the intelligence showed that Mr. Soleimani was planning to have forces carry out some sort of attack in the region that would have resulted in mass casualties of Americans with the intent of getting the American military to withdraw from Iraq, one of his main missions. Pelosi alerts House to be ready to send impeachment articles next week. Democrats claim the maneuver successfully spotlighted the need for the Senate to hear from witnesses and see documents that Mr. Trump barred from the House impeachment inquiry. On the night of the vote, Ms. Pelosi unexpectedly announced she would not immediately send the articles of impeachment to the Senate in an attempt to pressure the Republican-led chambers to commit to calling additional witnesses and requesting documents that Mr. Trump blocked during the House's inquiry. During the intervening 3 weeks between the House vote and Ms. Pelosi's announcement, relevant new documents that Mr. Trump suppressed have come to light, suggesting that there is additional evidence to support the charges the House brought. As U.S.-Iran tensions flare, Iraq is caught in the middle. A separate strike last week killed Iran's top military commander, the deputy chief of a coalition of Iraqi militias, and 8 other people, leading to a vote by Iraq's parliament to expel American forces from the country and a counterstrike by Iran on 2 American military posts in Iraq early Wednesday. The American mission in Iraq is to train Iraqi forces to fight the Islamic State, he said, and we're going to continue that mission. After the Iraqi parliament vote on Sunday, President Trump threatened to impose very big sanctions on Iraq if it ousted American forces, sanctions like they've never seen before. He also said that Iraq would have to reimburse the United States for billions of dollars it had invested in a major airbase there, although many remain grateful that the United States ousted the longtime dictator Saddam Hussein and fought alongside Iraqi forces to drive out the Islamic State. They are still pained by American military mistakes and decisions, including massive civilian casualties, during the war that followed the American invasion and the humiliating abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib. Why Pete Buttigieg has made religion central to his campaign. Look at what they do, he said at a campaign stop about 45 minutes outside of Des Moines, calling out Republicans for using faith as a way to tell some people they don't belong. It was okay, he added, for us to talk about how each of us are formed and where our faith takes us. And he challenged the notion that religious values are the province of the GOP. God does not belong to a political party in the United States of America, he told his listeners. In our White House, he says, as the camera cuts to a shot of a young black woman filming him with her phone, you won't have to shake your head and ask yourself whatever happened to, I was hungry, and you fed me. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. His campaign has hired a director of faith outreach, and Mr. Buttigieg recently hired a director of African American outreach, who visits black churches on his behalf. There's a line Obama used about the way the religious right would use faith as a weapon to bludgeon the people, as opposed to lift them up. And as people of faith, we need to be careful. Mr. Buttigieg's faith outreach probably won't do much good with skeptical voters, especially African Americans in Democratic primary, unless he is able to forge deeper connections. I honestly don't trust many people at Boeing. A broken culture exposed. Perhaps most tellingly, the documents show Boeing employees repeatedly questioning the competence of their own colleagues and the quality of the company's engineering. Ahead of a 2016 meeting to discuss training requirements for the plane, a Boeing employee described regulators as dogs watching TV. Another time, a Boeing employee wrote, "There's no confidence that the FAA is understanding what they are accepting." Airlines, which pay about $100 million apiece for the MAX, were derided as incompetent, their questions unreasonable. These documents do not represent the best of Boeing, Mr. Smith said in the email, which was obtained by the New York Times. With earthquakes and storms, Puerto Rico's power grid can't catch a break. From the California wildfires that prompted Pacific Gas and Electric to file bankruptcy, to the hurricanes and earthquakes that have upended the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, consumers are often finding themselves in the dark from power outages and facing soaring electric bills to repair ravaged power systems. Fuel for power plants must be imported, and when there is a shortage of electricity or when equipment fails, the power agency cannot draw from nearby utilities like those on the mainland. Ricardo Ramos, who headed Puerto Rico's power agency during Hurricane Maria and was ousted after a mishandling of the Whitefish contract in 2017, said every power plant was behind in maintenance when he took over as director earlier this year. Behind campus attack in India, some see a far-right agenda. At a rally last month, Pinky Chaudhary, president of the Hindu Raksha Dal, another far-right group, incited members to target students at the university. The state will, directly or through proxies, encourage violence against anyone who's not in tune with it. The violence on Sunday was related, at least in part, to months-long protest among student groups at the university over fee increases. Anushka Barua, a graduate student, said dozens of people with their faces covered rushed out of a nearby hospital chanting, "Hail Lord Ram." Four of the students said they heard the same slogan. What to know about Taiwan's presidential election? Voters in Taiwan are widely expected to deliver a victory on Saturday to President Tsai Ing-wen in defiance of China's pressure campaign against the island democracy. Xi Jinping, China's leader, has lured away some of the few countries that formally recognize Taiwan, as well as stepping up military air patrols and sending carriers through the Taiwan Strait. Beijing has tried to punish her by ending contact with her government, by poaching from Taiwan's handful of formal diplomatic allies, and by reducing the number of Chinese tourists who cross the Taiwan Strait. Fires threaten Australian towns that have already burned once. Rural fire service trucks refilling their water tanks as the Duns Road fire increased in ferocity. "I'm ready for it," he said, adding, "Fire is fairly haphazard. The relentlessness of the fires, which have burned more than 15 million acres, killed at least 24 people, and destroyed about 2,000 homes, is increasingly pushing Australia beyond crisis mode." New South Wales fire officials reported that a pair of blazes nearby were about to merge, and that lightning strike had started new fires farther north. In Poland, a stubborn defender of judicial independence. In the last 2 years, at least 20 judges have reported political harassment, while hundreds of judges and lawyers currently face threats of disciplinary proceedings, widely regarded as politically motivated. We will go back to the times of communism, when the judiciary was under the heel of politicians. We need to stand our ground while we still can. These days, Judge Tuleya, along with some of his peers from the Polish Judges Association, Justitia, spends more and more time outside the courtroom, traveling the country to help educate the public about the consequences of the government's threats to judicial independence. President Andrzej Duda said recently that the judges resist the changes only because they do not want the privileges and power over the people taken away. Judge Tuleya first gained prominence in 2013 when he issued his ruling in the trial of Dr. Miroslav Garlicki, a distinguished heart surgeon whom the Law and Justice-led government accused of taking bribes, sexual harassment, and killing a patient. Black Britons wonder what took Harry and Meghan so long. Young black women with no particular interest in the royal family gathered around their television screens and watched with excitement as the beautiful biracial American actress walked down the aisle of St. George's Chapel and took up her newly found status as the Duchess of Sussex. Since the Daily Mail's 2016 headline, "Harry's Girl is Straight Outta Compton," the Duchess has been the subject of dozens of racist and sexist stories, with references to her exotic DNA and descriptions of her family history going from cotton slaves to royalty via freedom in the U.S. Civil War. After the couple married in 2018 and Miss Markle officially joined the royal household, the tabloids shifted gears, presenting her as a termagant who shouted at her staff and brought her sister-in-law, Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, to tears. The relatively few people of color, and even fewer if you count only those who have African heritage, who rise to prominent success and prosperity in Britain, are often told we should be grateful or told to leave if we don't like it here. In the interviews, a persistent theme was surprise that senior members of the royal family had not shown enough support for Meghan. Buckingham Palace in emergency session to resolve Harry and Meghan crisis. Private secretaries for the Queen, Prince Charles, Prince William, and Prince Harry all took part in the session. Prince Charles, a longtime heir and Prince Harry's father, has taken charge of the response to the crisis, much as he did last November after his brother, Prince Andrew, gave a calamitous interview to the BBC about his dealings with the disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein. Unlike Prince Andrew, who was increasingly peripheral figure, Prince Harry and Meghan, along with Archie, have come to symbolize the family's future. Global stars with a multiracial family that has appeal throughout the British Commonwealth. Northern Ireland breaks a 3-year political stalemate. After 3 years of political paralysis, Northern Ireland's two main parties reached an agreement on Friday to restore the region's power-sharing government and revive its political institutions. The government in Northern Ireland is led by Sinn Féin, the main nationalist party, which supports unification with the Republic of Ireland, and the Democratic Unionist Party, or DUP, which wants to maintain close ties with Britain. With Brexit approaching, the need for a strong voice from Northern Ireland has never been more important, said Angela McGowan, Northern Ireland director of the Confederation of British Industry. China reports first death from new virus. Chinese state media on Saturday reported the first known death from a new virus that has infected dozens of people in China and set off worries across Asia. The Xinhua news agency cited the health commission in the central Chinese city of Wuhan, where the illness first appeared. In reporting the death, Chinese health officials have cautioned that more research is necessary to fully understand the new virus. U.S. says it won't discuss withdrawing troops from Iraq, defying Baghdad's request. The State Department on Friday rebuffed the Iraqi government's request to begin discussions on pulling out troops, saying that any American officials going to Baghdad during a state of heightened tensions would not discuss a troop withdrawal. Instead, discussions would be about the appropriate force posture in the Middle East. The statement from Washington was a direct rejoinder to Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi of Iraq, and was certain to add to the friction between the two nations. In a Thursday evening phone call, which Mr. Abdul Mahdi's office said Mr. Pompeo had initiated, the Iraqi Prime Minister said he had objected to dual violations of his country's sovereignty, referring to both the American drone strike of January 3rd on a convoy outside Baghdad International Airport, where General Soleimani and his aides had arrived on a flight from Damascus, and retaliatory missile strikes by Iran early Wednesday on bases in Iraq that house American troops. In a brief summary of the call, she said Mr. Pompeo reiterated the United States' condemnation of the Iranian regime's launch of ballistic missiles into two sites on Wednesday in Iraq that host Iraqi, American, and coalition forces working together to defeat ISIS. Mr. Pompeo stressed that the United States will do whatever it takes to protect the American and Iraqi people and to defend our collective interests, she added. Iran, united by loss of general, is divided over plane crash. The plane crash is only the latest in a series of deadly episodes for which Iranian critics have blamed their government, as speculation circulated on Iranian social media late Friday that the government might acknowledge some role in the crash. The groundswell of anger appeared to be growing. Some compared the government statements about the crash to false official statements that a barrage of Iranian missiles had killed 80 American troops in Iraq on Wednesday. Plane crash leaves Iranian diaspora in Canada grief-stricken. In all, 57 Canadians died, and a number of other victims appear to have been Iranian students studying in Canada. Although the crash has spread grief throughout the Iranian diaspora in Canada, the tragedy has disproportionately struck the city of Edmonton, capital of the oil-rich province of Alberta. It's a gift to Canada, and you know what? It's the regime's loss in Iran, said Payman Parsayan, the past president of the Iranian Heritage Society of Edmonton, speaking of the contributions the immigrants have made to Canada. Who signs up to fight? The makeup of U.S. recruits show glaring disparity. Rates of military service remain far from equal in the United States, and the gap may continue to widen because a driving decision to enlist is whether a young person knows anyone who served in the military. The South, where the culture of military service runs deep and military installations are plentiful, produces 20% more recruits than would be expected based on its youth population. In Colorado Springs, the high schools with the highest number of military families are also the biggest producers of recruits, Sergeant Combs said, adding that parents aware of the military's camaraderie, stability, and generous health, education, and retirement benefits often march their children into his office and encourage them to join. Alcohol deaths have risen sharply, particularly among women. The increase in deaths might also reflect the increase in opioid-related deaths, which in many cases can involve alcohol as well, and that would be reflected on death certificates. Alcohol can be left off death certificates when coroners or others identify a more immediate and obvious cause, such as a fall that broke a hip, not the alcohol that caused a person to fall in the first place. Specifically, the increase in alcohol deaths may reflect a bubble of baby boomers, while the dropping rates of alcohol use among teenagers may portend a brighter future. Iowa is at the center of the political storm. Ahead of every presidential election, candidates sprint across the first-in-the-nation nominating state to pitch themselves to voters as the best person to lead their party. There are the candidates, of course, who descend on the state in their painted buses and black SUVs, racing from middle school gymnasiums to coffee shops to senior centers to make their case to any heartland voter looking for a viable candidate. Weekdays in Iowa are mostly a respite. Many of the candidates have jobs back in Washington and return to the state on the weekends, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Elizabeth Warren opens a new front in disability policy. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota released a proposal on Friday, developed with disability rights groups, her campaign said, that would, among other things, expand home and community-based services, make technologies like speech-generating devices more accessible, increase Social Security disability payments, and strengthen anti-discrimination laws. In every way possible, the disability community helped us expand our understanding of both what needed to be done and what could be done. More than anything, people with disabilities marveled at the wide range of proposals in a single document, a breadth Ms. Warren alluded to in a Twitter question and answer session when she declared, "All policy issues are disability policy issues. All policy issues are disability policy issues," which is why I've approached many of my previous plans with a disability rights lens, from criminal justice reform to ensuring a high-quality public education for all to strengthening our democracy. Disability is a lens by which we can view how certain issues disproportionately impact people with disabilities. That is the disability scholar's dream, to hear that. People with disabilities describe a range of ways that plans like Ms. Warren's could change their lives. Trump fails to quash E. Jean Carroll's defamation suit. In a ruling made public on Thursday, Justice Doris Lynn Cohen of State Supreme Court in Manhattan rejected Mr. Trump's argument in a filing last week that New York's courts lacked jurisdiction to hear the case because he was not in New York and did not live in the state when he made the comments that Ms. Carroll says defamed her. Justice Lynn Cohen noted that Mr. Trump had failed to provide anything, not even a tweet, much less an affidavit, to support his position beyond his lawyer's statement that the President of the United States has resided in the White House for the past 3 years. The judge also denied Mr. Trump's accompanying request that discovery in the case be stayed. Ms. Carroll wrote last summer in a book excerpt, first published in New York Magazine, that Mr. Trump raped her in the late 1990s in a dressing room at Bergdorf Goodman in New York. Bernie Sanders leads tight race in new Iowa poll. Bernie Sanders edged ahead of his Democratic rival in Iowa, affirming his resurgence less than 4 weeks before next month's caucuses, according to a new poll from the Des Moines Register and CNN. The poll showed that Mr. Sanders was the first choice for 20% of would-be caucus goers, an increase of 5 percentage points from November, when the Register last polled the state. Amy Klobuchar, who has attracted more interest in recent weeks, but has yet to convert that into an increase in actual support, held steady at 6%, good for a distant fifth place in the polls. The deadline to qualify for Tuesday's Democratic debate was 11:59 p.m. on Friday, and normally an Iowa poll released hours before such a deadline could bolster candidates on the cusp of qualifying. He was cruising in a GOP primary, then Trump endorsed an ex-Democrat. He's not only running against Jeff Van Drew now, Kellyanne Conway, a counselor to the president, said of Mr. Richter. He's running against President Trump, too. Mr. Richter said he wasn't bothered by the NRCC snub. Mr. Stepien, as well as 2 others who spoke with Mr. Richter and requested anonymity to share private conversations, said Mr. Richter had stated his intention to stay in the race but would consider dropping out and running in the 3rd Congressional District instead, if we were promised financial support, the president's endorsement, and a public request to jump into the race. Texas governor shuts state to refugees, using new power granted by Trump. Texas has carried more than its share in assisting the refugee resettlement process and appreciates that other states are available to help with these efforts, Mr. Abbott said, adding that the state has resettled more refugees than any other state since the 2010 fiscal year. These families have been torn apart by violence, war, persecution, but we never thought they would be needlessly separated by a U.S. state official. Many communities have said they would open their doors to refugees, including 42 states and at least 90 local governments, according to a spokesman for Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which has been tracking the number of letters consenting to refugee resettlement. At a campaign rally in October, he told an almost entirely white crowd in Minneapolis that he would give local communities greater comment in refugee policy, noting that previous leaders in Washington brought large numbers of refugees to your state from Somalia. Kenneth T. Cuccinelli, the second acting director of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, said in an interview in October that the order would ensure local and state governments were accountable for the decisions. It's to put real teeth in it on the state and local side, said Mr. Cuccinelli. FBI apologizes to court for botching surveillance of Trump advisor and pledges fixes. A chastened FBI told the secretive court on Friday that it was increasing training and oversight for officials who work on national security wiretap applications in response to problems uncovered by a scathing Inspector General report last month about botched surveillance targeting a former Trump campaign advisor. The FBI has the utmost respect for this court and deeply regrets the errors and omissions identified by the Inspector General, wrote the FBI Director Christopher A. Wray, in a statement included with the filing. The frequency with which representations made by the FBI personnel turned out to be unsupported or contradicted by information in their possession, and with which they withheld information detrimental to their case, calls into question whether information contained in other FBI applications is reliable, Judge Collier wrote. House Democrats push environmental bills, but victories are few. The Trump administration's EPA is breaking its own promises every day that it delays and puts polluters ahead of the American people, she said, before 24 Republicans joined all but one Democrat to pass the act, 247 to 159, on the chemicals known as PFAS. In stark contrast, the House is taking action, but the measure, the PFAS Action Act, already has a veto threat looming over it, and its prospects in the Senate, like those in other House bills addressing environmental regulation and climate change, are slim to none. The Republican position on climate change remains absurd, said Representative Frank Pallone, Jr., a Democrat of New Jersey, who is the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and an architect of another piece of climate legislation introduced this week. We're the responsible party, aren't we? Said Representative Kathy Castor, Democrat of Florida, who leads the House Select Committee on the climate crisis. Doug Collins apologizes for claiming Democrats are in love with terrorists. Representative Doug Collins of Georgia apologized on Friday for accusing Democrats of being in love with terrorists, a claim he hurled during a bitterly partisan dispute over whether to curtail President Trump's war-making power in Iran. Mr. Collins, a strident ally of the president and a leading force in his impeachment defense in the House, made the remarks in a television interview this week, as the House was preparing to debate a Democratic-led resolution to force Mr. Trump to go to Congress for authorization before taking further military action against Iran. Mr. Trump set the tone for the Republicans early in the day, claiming that Democrats were effectively supporting Major General Qasem Soleimani, Iran's top security commander, who was killed last week in a drone strike he authorized, by raising concerns about his actions. Stephanie Grisham, Trump's press secretary, who doesn't meet the press. If you have $200,000 to play with, why not just help children because it's a good thing to do? Miss Grisham, 43, said in an email to Jake Tapper of CNN. Miss Grisham did take questions on Wednesday from the Sinclair anchor Eric Bolling, a former Fox News personality. The view inside the White House is that Miss Grisham, who also serves as a communications director for both Mr. Trump and the First Lady, Melania Trump, has improved her on-camera approach. If the president is constantly engaging with the press, there's not as much need to be out in front. Still, Ms. Grisham's lack of visibility has sparked speculation among allies of the president that she may modify or step back from her role at the conclusion of Mr. Trump's impeachment trial in the Senate. Boeing 737 MAX supplier cuts jobs as fallout from ground spreads. The company Spirit Aerosystems said it was making the cuts at a plant in Wichita in response to the temporary production halt that Boeing announced last month. Like many of those aerospace suppliers, Spirit is heavily reliant on Boeing. The MAX alone accounts for more than 50% of the company's annual revenue. After Boeing said in April that it would slow production of the MAX to 42 planes a month from 52, the chief executive of Spirit, Tom Gentile, told investors that the company would freeze some hiring, reduce overtime, and decrease its use of contractors, changing rules to help bankers and hurt poor neighborhoods. The current crop of federal banking regulators picked by President Trump is now proposing to let banks pump less money into lower income communities, and even to claim credit for lending that does not benefit those communities. Yes, you read that right. Under the proposal, the banks that finance the new sound system at M&T Bank Stadium in Baltimore could claim credit for investing in the community. Under the current system, regulators evaluate the amount of money a bank pumps into the community and separately evaluate the services it provides, such as bank branches and low-cost checking accounts. 2 deaths and my life. No, the death in quick succession of 2 friends was a catalyst. How so? In his gentleness that contained wisdom, in his diffidence that contained enthusiasm, in his discretion that contained curiosity. Earlier in December, Ward Just, a journalist who turned to fiction, a great Washington Post correspondent in Vietnam, who became a great novelist, died at the age of 84. Of course, Bernie can win. As with Sanders, Mr. Trump was seen as being way outside his party's mainstream, a protectionist in a party of free traders, an isolationist in a party of interventionists, a libertine in a party of moralists. As with Sanders, Trump barely belonged to the party whose nomination he sought. As with Sanders, Trump's message was that he was fighting a rigged system. And as with Sanders, the ideological distaste for Trump among conservatives was matched to the conviction that he couldn't possibly win. Why do people believe in hell? It's comforting to imagine that Christians generally accept the notion of hell, of eternal misery, not because they're emotionally attached to it, but because they see it as a small, inevitable zone of darkness peripheral to a larger spiritual landscape that, viewed in its totality, they find ravishingly lovely. Still, none of that accounts for the deep emotional need many modern Christians seem to have for an eternal hell. An old monk on Mount Athos in Greek once told me that people rejoice in the thought of hell to the precise degree that they harbor hell within themselves. Why America needs a royal family. Like everyone else on the internet, I've been watching the Royal Rumble as Prince Harry and his American bride are attempting to carve out new roles in the royal family, and I've reached a conclusion. We, the American people, need some royals of our own. Elected royal couples would eliminate the problem of the unpaid first ladies, shifting the burden of being a hostess, a charity patron, and fashion plate onto the shoulders of someone who has the skills for it, allowing the president's spouse to continue on whatever path he or she previously chose. Healthcare administrator, librarian, lawyer, Pilates class frequenter. For all we know, Prince Charles, who's been kind of a yawn as a royal, could have been a solid politician. And our disastrous president might have been at least a contained disaster as King Donald I. The downed Ukrainian airliner assessing blame. Under the law, we are responsible for accidental consequences of our actions that a rational observer would anticipate. The poor judgment to fly a commercial airliner into an aerospace with active missile launches taking place is inexplicable. The death of Major General Qasem Soleimani was justified for all the death and destruction his leadership caused. Harry and Meghan going their own way. I have no fear that the British royal family is in jeopardy due to this couple's decision, and even if it were, does that really deserve to be covered as a catastrophic and earth-shattering global event? I am British and do not share the interest shown by many Americans in the British royals. I would like to think that Meghan and Harry's actions will serve as a catalyst to the inevitable change occurring to the British monarchy in reality. The only way they can have any kind of impact on this system is if they choose to remove themselves entirely from the royal system, refuse their inheritance, and drop the royal titles. Harry has made no secret of how the death of his mother in a car accident after being chased by members of the British tabloid press has affected his emotional growth. After 190 years, the most famous bar you've never heard of avoids last call. Loisant Gordon, who owns Near's Tavern in Queens, likes to call the place the most famous bar you've never heard of. Near's claim to its limited fame comes from its age. It opened in 1829 in the Woodhaven neighborhood, and Mr. Gordon has long said that makes it the oldest bar in New York City to continuously operate in the same location. In 2015, Mr. Gordon and some historians tried to have the bar's interior landmarked by the city, noting the historical value of the 19th century mahogany bar and its old-fashioned ice coil tap system, as well as other artifacts. A Queens bar has rich history, but lacks. Oh, that's a title. But the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission rejected the application, concluding that the bar's interior did not rise to the level of significance necessary for designation as a landmark. Fieldston Elite Private School faces backlash from Jewish parents. The tensions boiled over on Thursday when the school fired a history teacher who has criticized Israel in school and on a personal Twitter account. Lauren Colston, a spokeswoman for the school, declined to discuss the precise reasons for the firing, saying that Fieldston does not comment on personal matters. We can reaffirm that the school does not tolerate hurtful, offensive, or exclusionary content or comments from any member of the community, Ms. Colston said on Friday. Fieldston spent much of the last year trying to contain a rebellion by its students, some of whom locked themselves in buildings on the school's campus in the Riverdale section of the Bronx in March to protest what they said was a racist school culture. She was 92 and loved cats, and an attack left her dead on the street. On Monday evening, while taking what neighbors described as one of her regular strolls, Miss Fuertes was attacked just steps from her home by a 21-year-old man who approached her from behind and knocked her to the ground, the police said. Miss Fuertes, who neighbors say was from the Dominican Republic and had lived in the area with her sons for years, collected cans and plastic bottles for a living. If Miss Fuertes needed help crossing the road, her neighbors would not hesitate to walk with her. 2-month-old twins in city-funded homeless shelter die. On its website, The Landing, a former motel near LaGuardia Airport, describes itself as a temporary homeless shelter with a capacity for 169 families that is financed by the city's Department of Homeless Services. The Homeless Services Agency requires that all family shelters provide parents with materials about safe sleeping for infants. Although pregnancy is not officially listed as a reason someone would be eligible for shelter, social services officials have said it is often intertwined with factors like overcrowding, family discord, and domestic violence that do qualify. After a decade of hiring, plenty of jobs, but raises are tiny. Cooling job creation is normal in the 11th year of an economic expansion and a record-breaking streak of job gains. As rosy as the numbers look from a high level, there's still pain out there. Job cuts are happening, industries that are struggling, and people losing their jobs, he said. Preliminary data released over the summer indicated that job growth through last spring was weaker by about 500,000 jobs than initial estimates. A glimpse of our connected tech future, courtesy of CES 2020. The company said its virtual assistant is used by more than 500 million people a month across more than 90 countries. Google said its virtual assistant is now used by more than 500 million people a month across more than 90 countries. We're looking more at talking about safety and saving lives versus it's super cool. Your car comes to you now when you call it, Ms. Milanesi said. Buckle up for another Facebook election. Unlike Google, which restricted the targeting of political ads last year, or Twitter, which barred political ads entirely, Facebook and its chief executive, Mark Zuckerberg, decided to preserve the status quo. Mr. Stamos, like some Facebook employees and outside agitators, had advocated for small but meaningful changes to Facebook's policies, such as raising the minimum size of an audience that a political advertiser is allowed to target, and disallowing easily disprovable claims made about a political candidate by his or her rivals. Ultimately, Mr. Zuckerberg's decision to leave Facebook's platform architecture intact amounts to a powerful endorsement, not of any 2020 candidate, but of Facebook's role in global democracy. How to get socially conscious funds into your 401k. Just 2.9% of 401k plans have even a single fund dedicated to environmental, social, and governance issues, according to the Plan Sponsor Council of America's most recent member survey. Socially conscious funds have crept into the mainstream over the last couple of decades, and funds that focus on big American companies are a more mature area of socially conscious investing. Already have a bare bones index of funds of large American stocks in your plan? Carefully choose and then add a single ESG fund covering the same sector, instead of swapping it into the plan and ditching the index fund. Alphabet's chief legal officer stepping down amid investigation. David Drummond, the chief legal officer of Google's parent company, Alphabet, and one of its most senior executives, is leaving the internet giant amid an investigation into his relationships with women who worked at the company. Last month, in announcing that Mr. Page and Mr. Brin plan to step down from executive roles at the company, Alphabet announced that Sundar Pichai, Google's chief executive, would also leave the parent company. Among the subjects of the inquiry were Mr. Drummond's relationships with women at the company, according to the document. Jeffrey Epstein gave $850,000 to MIT, and administrators knew. According to the report, the men debated whether to accept Mr. Epstein's money in the absence of any MIT policy regarding controversial gifts. They reached a compromise. Under an informal framework, the school would accept the donations while insisting that the gifts be small and unpublicized to prevent Mr. Epstein from using them to improve his reputation or gain influence at the university, the report said. The report found that Mr. Epstein's presence on campus had disturbed Media Lab staff members. Investigators were told that Mr. Epstein was sometimes accompanied by young female assistants, and that Mr. Ito probably sensed their nervousness. A Media Lab communications employee distributed photos of one event to other people at the lab, writing an email that they should feel free to post on social media, as long as Jeffrey Epstein does not appear in any of the photos. News reports about other internal emails previously demonstrated how Media Lab officials had obfuscated Mr. Epstein's relationship with the program. BBC underpaid female TV host, tribunal rules. The television host, who took the BBC to court over unequal pay, has won the first high-profile court case to be brought since the fallout over pay disparity at the public broadcaster began more than 2 years ago. The tribunal found that the work that Ms. Ahmed did was similar to that done by Mr. Vine, and that the BBC had failed to prove that the difference in pay was not due to sex discrimination. I'd call on the BBC to learn the lessons from this judgment and to work constructively with the NUJ to sort these cases out. Ms. Ahmed's victory is likely to embolden others with a complaint about the BBC, according to the Fawcett Society, a charity that campaigns for gender equality. CNN agrees to pay $76 million to settle allegations it violated federal labor laws. An administrative law judge ruled in 2008 that CNN violated the National Labor Relations Act and that CNN was a joint employer with Team Video Services. The union said CNN appealed the decision to the United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, which upheld most of the board's findings in 2017 and enforced its order that CNN cease and desist from refusing to recognize and bargain with the unions. The payments will compensate them for the protracted length of the case and the tax consequences from the size of the payouts, the union said, adding that it will withdraw all pending charges against CNN. Peter B. Robb, the board's general counsel, said that the settlement demonstrates the board's continued commitment to enforcing the law and ensuring employees who are treated unfairly obtain the monetary relief ordered by the board. Economy in a nutshell: manufacturing in recession, services booming. The manufacturing recession underway shows up in the manufacturing recession underway shows up in the unemployment numbers. The nation's factories shed 12,000 jobs in December, with the steepest loss in the making of fabricated metal products. Only 8.4% of all jobs were in manufacturing in December, continuing a long downward trend since World War II. Pay is rising fastest for low earners. If you are a manufacturing worker losing your job, you probably have more options than when the same thing happens in a recession. The secret of their success: it's not about money. Bob Parsons is best known as the founder of GoDaddy, the domain registration company that grabbed attention with provocative television commercials in the early 2000s. Neither of their ventures was based on creating a new industry. There were more airlines than there are today when JetBlue started, and Mr. Parsons said the domain registration market was full of registrars when he got into it. At Scottsdale National, Mr. Parsons has limited the membership to 145 people. New law expands uses for 529 college savings accounts. The distribution counts as student income and can reduce a student's eligibility for need-based aid by as much as half of the withdrawal from a 529 account by itself is not going to solve the student's loan problems, said Carrie Warwick, Director of the Policy and Advocacy for the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the National College Access Network, a nonprofit group that advocates on behalf of low-income students. If you have significantly greater than $10,000 in loans, she said, it's not a game changer. Here are some questions and answers about the new 529 rules. Can I use 529 money to repay private student loans, as well as federal loans? The provision applies to federal and most private student loans. That has been Reading the Times for Saturday, January 11th, 2020. Reading the Times for Saturday, January 11th, 2020.